Hello to everybody taking gender-based violence on campus. It's John Foubert once again, and this week's topic is pornography and its connection to sexual violence. So what I thought I would do is to talk a little bit about the two studies that I authored that are in your readings this week, and just use that as a springboard to introduce the topic, and then on our discussion board, certainly we'll talk about all the articles, but I thought it'd be the best use of our time to have me go over the two studies that I did so you can get a little insight into those, why they were done, how they were done, that kind of thing. So first one is Foubert, Brosi, and Bannon. And in that particular study, we were interested to find out how different types of pornography affect men's likelihood of raping, their likelihood of committing sexual assault, their bystander efficacy, bystander willingness, and rape myth acceptance. So had a lot in there. Now, to define those terms briefly, bystander efficacy is the degree to which you feel like you could intervene if you wanted to. Bystander willingness, are you willing to intervene if you see a situation that might turn into a rape? Rape myth acceptance, false or stereotype beliefs about rape victims, and perpetrators. And then what's the other? Oh, likelihood of raping and likelihood of sexual assault. How that is defined is that they're actually one item scales. And for likelihood of raping, it's on a scale of 1 to 5. How likely are you? You like that? 1, 5, yeah. It's how likely would you be to commit rape if you could be assured of not being caught or punished. And other studies over the years have shown anywhere between a fifth to a third of men will indicate some likelihood of raping if they were assured of not being caught or punished. Now, most of those men are on the 2 of the 1 to 5 scales, which is coded somewhat unlikely. So it's sort of unlikely, somewhat unlikely, maybe yes, maybe no, likely, very likely, something like that. So anyway, we attempted to get every fraternity man on a large Midwestern public campus to respond to a survey, and we were able to get to 62% of the entire population, which is a pretty substantial part of a population. And what we found, several things. We found, first of all, that 83% of these men had viewed pornography at least some point in the last year. Now, that could be once, could be 10 times a day. The measure was limited in that regard, but at least once in the last year they had. And there were a number of different effects. Those who had viewed mainstream pornography, they had a higher likelihood of rape and a higher likelihood of committing sexual assault when compared to those who had not viewed pornography. Then we had another group that that self-identified rather as having viewed sadomasochistic pornography, which essentially would involve things like whipping, beating, chains, and other sorts of physically restrictive, confining, and often somewhat violent, at least in nature, and sometimes very violent. So about 27% of the men said that they had viewed that type of pornography in the last year, and those who had, relative to those who had not, were more likely to rape, more likely to commit sexual assault, higher rape myth acceptance, and they had lower bystander efficacy, which is kind of the bad side. You don't want to be low in efficacy, you want to be high in efficacy. And we hypothesized that they probably had a more difficult time knowing what to do when they saw some type of sexual behavior combined with violence, because they saw that interchanged in what they were seeing, which sort of desensitized them to the intersections between sexual behavior and violence. And then we looked at a group that had viewed rape pornography in the last year. It's fairly self-explanatory as to what that is. About 1 in 5 men had looked at that, and those who had, more likely to rape, more likely to commit sexual assault, higher rape myth acceptance, and they as opposed to a lower bystander efficacy, they had lower bystander willingness to intervene. So that was more serious in the sense that it wasn't just that they didn't think they knew how, it's that even if they knew how, they weren't going to. So, and that in and of itself is not surprising, given that they were watching media that they were using for sexual pleasure that included rape, and how could then they possibly want to intervene to prevent that to begin with? So not too surprising. So that was that study, and then in an additional study later I did with Andrew Rizzo, um, we wanted to study a little bit more broadly different factors that might impact pornography use as it relates to bystander intervention. So we studied a couple of different religiosity variables. We studied reasons people view pornography. We studied how frequently they use it. So not just check if you used it last year, but a more sophisticated measure. And so we found lots of things. And I'd encourage you to kind of bear with me for a second here, because it can be a little confusing the first time you hear some of these results, but I think it's worth knowing. There were a number of different variables we looked at and their relationships on a bivariate level. So between the two different variables, what was correlated, what wasn't. And I'll talk about those dividing up men and women, because men and women's reaction to pornography tends to be much different. So for men, they had a positive correlation between viewing internet pornography and what's called extrinsic religiosity. Now, extrinsic religiosity is essentially participating in religious activities because you see personal gain resulting from it. More business contacts, you think you can kind of fool God into doing what you want him to do, those sorts of things. So they'll check those kind of boxes on a survey. So those who use religion for their own personal means, social standing, that sort of thing, they were also more likely to use pornography. And then there were a couple other relationships worth noting. One was that the more people, the more men had an intrinsic religiosity, intrinsic being studying the religious texts, and essentially taking their religion as a personal part of their lives and applying that to their actual behavior. So the more men were essentially serious about their religion on a very personal level, seek to integrate that into their lives, the fewer reasons that they had and noted for using pornography. So that was interesting. Another relationship with intrinsic religiosity was that they also used pornography frequently the higher they were in intrinsic religiosity. So not terribly surprising there. With women, some effects as well. The more intrinsically motivated they were for religion, the less their bystander efficacy was. So the more the women used religion to obtain social standing, the less willing, or the less efficacious, the less effective they felt they could be to intervene to help prevent rape. And then on the flip side, another result was with women, the more intrinsic their religion was and how much they applied it to their lives, that also was more associated with both their reasons for using pornography, having more reasons, and their use of pornography. Negative relationships there. So higher intrinsic religiosity, fewer reasons to use, and fewer times actually using it. So, and then the other thing, there was a relationship among women for increased porn use and having a lower bystander efficacy. So those were some of the results there. There are two that I would point to in addition to that. We did a regression to try to predict different variables, and one of interest was that if you take a look at religiosity, globally speaking, the different ways of measuring that, and pornography use, reasons for using it. That is as what's called a block of variables, and the religiosity block. You can predict 19% of the variance in women's bystander efficacy, essentially meaning that if we know a bit about um, how what their religious beliefs are like and how they act on those, and we know about their pornography use, we are then able to predict 19% of what there is and any kind of variability in their bystander efficacy. So a significant chunk. The other final thing that I would say about that study was we found huge variability in men's bystander efficacy, just as an individual variable. Much less variability among women's bystander efficacy, so women were more similar in how effective they thought they could be to intervene in a sexual violence situation, but men were all over the map. There were some that were felt like they were very able, others felt very unable. That, I think, would be an interesting place for further research to come in. Who are these men who are interested or who feel like they're effective at intervening to help prevent sexual violence, and who are those who aren't? How do they differ? That awaits further research, perhaps by one of you. I look forward to a great week of class, and I hope we have some lively discussion.